The beacon came in at 4:12 in the afternoon on the second Tuesday of September. And the first thing I noticed was that it shouldn't have existed. I was at the Camas Creek station finishing a structural report on a culvert when dispatch relayed it. A 406 megahertz emergency signal, registered, decoding to a beacon identifier that our system flagged as decommissioned. Not unregistered, decommissioned. Someone had gone through the paperwork years ago to retire that transmitter from service, and the database still held its ghost. The coordinates put it at Halverson Point, up on the north spine of the Elwater National Forest, at the top of a lookout tower that had been closed since before I joined the service. I need to say something before I go any further, because I've started this story a dozen times and stopped. And I've decided that if I'm going to tell it at all, I'm going to tell it plainly and in order, the way I would file an incident report, and let you draw your own conclusions the way I was forced to draw mine. I spent 19 years believing that paper does not lie, that a record, properly kept, is the closest thing a person can hold to the truth. I do not believe that anymore. By the end of what I'm about to tell you, you may not either. And if this account does anything at all, I hope it makes you look twice at the next empty lookout tower you see standing alone above the trees. If you have ever wondered what happens to those towers after the service walks away from them, stay with me, because I'm going to tell you exactly what happens to at least one of them. And it is not what any of us were told. I want to be precise about my state of mind, because everything that came after depends on you understanding that I did not walk up that mountain expecting anything. 19 years in the Forest Service teaches you that impossible readings are almost always boring. A beacon flagged as decommissioned usually means someone found an old EPIRB at an estate sale and set it off in their garage. Crossband interference, a solar event, a corrupted record in a database that hadn't been properly migrated in 3 system upgrades. I have chased dozens of impossible signals in my career. Every one of them had a stupid human explanation. And I trusted that the way I trusted the sun to set. When the sky does something strange, you don't assume the sky has changed. You assume you're looking at it wrong. So when dispatch asked who could respond, I said I could. And I meant it the way you'd volunteer to reset a tripped breaker. Let me tell you a little about how these things work, because it matters later. When an emergency beacon transmits, the signal is picked up by satellite and routed through the National Coordination Center, which decodes the registration and pushes the alert down to whatever agency owns the ground it's coming from. Ours is a big district. The Elwater covers most of a mountain range and 2 river drainages, close to 1 million acres, and we manage it the way every district does with a skeleton crew, a lot of driving, and an institutional memory that lives in the heads of a handful of people who have been there forever. When a beacon fires, we treat it as a life safety event until proven otherwise. Someone could be dying under it. You go. You don't sit around theorizing about database errors while a hunter bleeds out on a ridge. So the fact that the identifier came back decommissioned did not stop the response. It just made the response mine, because I was the closest qualified body with a truck and daylight left. Halverson Point is a hard climb. The service road that used to reach the base was gated and gone to alders in the 90s. The last 1.5 miles is a foot trail that the district stopped maintaining around the same time, and it shows. I pulled the file on the drive up, or tried to. The digital record for Halverson Point was thin to the point of insult. Constructed 1936. L4 cab. Decommissioned and mothballed 1994. Structure retained pending disposition. That was nearly all of it. There was a note that the access trail had been formally closed to the public in 1996 for safety, and a maintenance flag that hadn't been touched in years for a structure the government had owned for 90 years. There was almost nothing to read, and I remember thinking that was odd, because the service keeps everything. We are a religion of documentation. We have files on outhouses. But I filed that oddness under budget and neglect, the way you do, and I kept driving. I parked at the old gate at 5:40, logged my departure with dispatch, and started up with a handheld, a camera, my documentation kit, and the flat certainty that I'd be back down before full dark with a photo of a dead transmitter and a story for the break room. The trail is worse than closed. It's forgotten. Blowdown across it in a dozen places, the tread washed out and revegetated, the kind of trail your boots stop believing in. There's a difference between a trail nobody maintains and a trail nobody walks. And this was both. A maintained trail that people simply stop using still holds the shape of feet. This one had gone back to the mountain entirely. I had to route find in 3 places, working off the old cut line where the trail crew had once notched the trees, following blazes so old they'd healed over into scars. I remember stopping at a switchback about 2/3 up to catch my breath and thinking that nobody had come this way in a very long time. And I made myself check, because that's the job I looked for sign. There were no fresh cuts on the blowdown. No boot prints in the 2 muddy stretches where boot prints survived for weeks. No candy wrappers, no cairns, none of the small litter of human passage. No scat displaced. No crushed vegetation. No broken spider lines across the corridor. And this time of year in that country, the spiders string the trail overnight, so that anyone who's walked it that day walks through their webs. I walked through webs the whole way up. That told me, as clearly as anything can, that I was the first person on that trail that day. If someone had gone up ahead of me, they had done it without touching the ground. The tower came into view around 6:50, black against a sky going orange. Halverson Point Lookout, a standard L4 cab on a 14-foot timber base. The design the service built by the hundreds in the 30s and 40s, a single 14 by 14 room of windows on a squat wooden tower. The classic sentinel you've seen in photographs. A glass box on stilts on top of a mountain. The catwalk railing had rotted through in one section. The shutters were down over the windows, which is how they mothballed these towers. You lower the big wooden shutters over the glass and lock the place up against the winters. And the shutters were gray and swollen with 40 of those winters. The stovepipe was gone. The lightning ground cable had corroded off the frame and lay coiled at the base like a dead snake. The whole structure had the particular deadness of a building that stopped being a building and became a monument to itself. It was not sinister. That's the part I want you to hold on to. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. An old, dead, forgotten tower on a lonely mountain. The kind of thing the service has hundreds of, slowly going back to the weather because there's no money to save them and no will to tear them down. I climbed the stair. The treads flexed under my weight but held, and I tested each one, because falling through rotten stairs is how rangers actually die on jobs like this, far more than anything dramatic. And at the top, at the trapdoor landing and the cab door, I found exactly what a closed tower should look like. The door was secured, not just shut secured with a hasp and a Forest Service padlock. And the lock was seized with rust so complete that the shackle and the body had become one piece. I have opened a lot of old government locks. You can usually work them with oil and patience and a little violence. This one was beyond that. It was not a lock anymore. It was a rusted lump in the rough shape of a lock, welded to itself by 3 decades of freeze and thaw. I photographed it before I touched it, out of habit, and then I put my hand on it and pulled and confirmed what the photo already showed. Nobody had gone through that door. The hasp was rusted into its staple. The screws holding the hasp to the frame were painted over with the same swollen gray as the wood. To open that door, you would have had to destroy it, and it was not destroyed. There's a second way into an L4 cab, through the trap door in the floor of the catwalk that lets you up from the stair landing into the room. And I checked that too, because a good investigator does not accept the first locked door as proof of anything. Also secured, from the inside, wired shut, the way a lookout closing up for the season would have done it. You drop the trap, you run a wire through the hasp and twist it off, so nothing can push up into the cab over the winter. The wire was one solid orange rind of rust. It had not been untwisted and retwisted. Rust doesn't lie about that. When you disturb corroded metal, it flakes. The break shows bright. This wire was uniform, undisturbed, sealed in its own decay. Whoever had wired that trap had done it a very long time ago, and no one had touched it since. So I stood on the catwalk of a locked tower that no one had entered in 30 years, holding a camera, listening on my handheld to the coordination center confirm that yes, the beacon was still transmitting right now from directly beneath my feet, an emergency signal from a tower with no power. And I did the thing I always do when the world stops making sense. I got methodical. Panic is just curiosity with nowhere to go, and procedure is where you put it. I photographed the shutters, all of them, in sequence. I checked each one for a route in, and on the north side, I found a gap in the swollen wood where one shutter had warped away from its frame, maybe 4 inches, enough to get a lens and a flashlight through. It was not a way in for a person. A cat couldn't have gotten through it. But I could get my light and my eye to it, and I did. Dust. That was my first thought, and it was a relief, because dust is normal. Dust is time behaving correctly. Every horizontal surface inside the cab wore a coat of it, thick and undisturbed, gray-brown, the sediment of decades, the specific deep felt of dust that has never been touched. The kind you cannot fake, because faking undisturbed dust is very nearly impossible. The moment you introduce anything to a room, you disturb it, and it settles differently. And a trained eye sees the difference. This dust was continuous. It lay over the window sills and the map cabinet and the floor like snow that had never had a footprint in it. The old Osborne fire finder still stood on its cabinet in the center of the room, the way they always did the round alidade table the lookout uses to shoot a compass bearing on a column of smoke. A beautiful old instrument, a brass sighting device on a circular map of the district, the single most important tool in a working lookout. It wore its coat of dust like everything else. The stool sat near it, and the radio was gone. There was an empty steel mounting frame where a set used to bolt in, and inside the frame, nothing. Just 4 bright bolt holes and a rectangle of slightly cleaner wood where the chassis had once shielded the floor from the falling dust. No radio, no power, no battery bank, no solar panel, no wiring. Nothing that could make a transmitter breathe, let alone transmit a coded emergency signal to a satellite 300 miles up. And on the firefinder table, sitting square in the center of the dust, was the logbook. I need you to understand how wrong that was before you understand anything else. Because if you don't work in this world, you'll skip right past it. And it's the first thread in the whole thing. When a lookout is closed, the logbook goes down the mountain. It is a legal record. It documents fire observations, which are legal events. A lookout's time-stamped report of a smoke can be the difference in a wildfire investigation, in a liability case, in a fatality review. So the log gets boxed and archived at the district office along with everything else, and the tower is closed empty. You do not leave the official log in a mothballed tower any more than a ship's captain leaves the ship's log floating in the harbor when he decommissions the ship. Its being there at all, sitting out on the table in a sealed and abandoned building, was the first genuinely impossible thing. And I almost missed it, because I was so relieved by the dust that I nearly let the dust close the case in my head. Sealed room, untouched. Nobody's been here. Beacon must be a fluke. Done. Then I saw the second thing, and the relief went out of me like water out of a cracked glass. The book was open, and around it, on the table, the dust was disturbed. Not everywhere, that was the horror of it. Everywhere else in that cab, the dust lay perfect and continuous, a sealed and undisturbed 30-year sediment. But right there, in a small island around the open logbook, the dust was disturbed in a specific and legible way. A clean arc swept across the page-facing edge of the book, exactly the arc a hand makes when it turns a page. A clean oval to the right of the book, exactly where a forearm rests when someone leans over a page to write. The rest of the table wore its decades of dust. That one small working area, and only that area, had been used recently by someone leaning over the book with a right forearm resting on the table and a right hand turning the page, in a room that had been sealed since before I owned my first uniform. I moved the light to the open page, and I could read the top lines through the gap. Standard format. The old format. The pre-computer format. The one the service used for lookout logs going back to the Civilian Conservation Corps days when men built these towers by hand. Date, time, visibility in miles, wind, direction, and speed, temperature, relative humidity if you had a psychrometer to swing, smoke observations, radio checks. It was filled out correctly, cleanly, in a legible hand. And at the top of the page, in the date field, someone had written that day's date. That Tuesday, September's second Tuesday, the day I was standing there, the day the beacon fired. I keyed my handheld, and I raised dispatch, and I told them, flatly, professionally, the way you're trained to, that I had a secured tower with no signs of entry, no power, no radio, undisturbed dust throughout, and an open logbook on the table with an entry dated today. And I requested they log the time of my report and advise on next steps. And even as I said it, I was already composing the incident report in my head, the way you do, already reaching for the category that would let me sleep. Vandalism. A hoax. Someone with a helicopter and a sick sense of humor. Some rude inn I hadn't found a floorboard pried loose, a shutter that lifted out, some clever access that a determined person could use and reseal behind them. There is always a rational answer. My entire career was built on the certainty that there is always a rational answer, and I was reaching for it with both hands. Dispatch was quiet for a moment. Then a different voice came on. Not the dispatcher. A man named Roy Dean, who had been with the Elwater district longer than anyone alive, a maintenance and communications veteran 2 years from his own retirement. The kind of man who quietly fixes the things that other people file work orders about and then forget. He knew every repeater, every buried cable, every old antenna site in 1,000,000 acres. I hadn't known he was in the dispatch office that evening. I would find out later that he wasn't, exactly. When the decommissioned beacon flagged in the system, it did not just page the on-call dispatcher. It also paged Roy Dean, personally, on a device the district didn't know he carried. That routing had been configured a long time ago by someone for exactly this, and nobody in the current office knew it existed. Roy had driven in when his pager went off, and he'd been standing behind the dispatcher listening before I ever made my first call. Roy's voice was low and even, and he did not sound surprised. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that turned my spine to cold water before I understood a single fact. He did not sound surprised. He sounded like a man confirming an appointment he'd been dreading for years. "Ranger," he said, "before you touch that book, if someone signed it, count how many entries came before yours." I stood there with the light in the gap and I said, "Before mine." "Roy, I didn't sign anything. I haven't even opened it. I can't reach it. I'm looking through a gap in the shutters." There was a silence on the channel that went on a beat too long, a silence with a shape to it. "Count them," he said. "Then come down. Don't take the book. Don't try to get inside. Leave it exactly where it is. Photograph the last page through the gap, and come down. I'll meet you at the gate." "Roy," I said, "what am I looking at?" "Count them," he said again. And then quieter, almost to himself, in a way I don't think he meant to key open, so that it came across the channel half swallowed. "And see whose name's at the top of today's. I want to tell you I demanded answers right there. That I stood on that catwalk and refused to move until a man 3 ridges away explained himself. What I actually did was follow the procedure a man I respected had just handed me, because that is what you do in the field. When someone with 30 extra years and a voice like that says leave it and come down, you leave it and you come down. And you save your questions for the gate. But I did count. I couldn't reach the book, couldn't turn its pages through a 4-inch gap, so I did the only counting available to me. I photographed the open page at the highest resolution my camera would give, holding the flashlight along the barrel to rake the light across the ink so the entries would stand up out of the paper. And I photographed the closed block of the book from the side, edge on. so the image would show the thickness of the written pages pressed against the thickness of the blank ones, the way you'd measure how much of a book has been used without opening it. I told myself I'd count them properly from the images, at my kitchen table, under good light, where things make sense. Before I climbed down, I put the light through the gap one more time, slowly, and I made myself look at the whole cab instead of the book. Because that is what you are trained to do, document the scene. Not the single thing that is screaming for your attention, photograph the whole room. Let the details you don't understand yet get recorded, so that later, when you know more, they'll be waiting for you. And that discipline is how I saw the detail I've never been able to explain, the one I could not make myself put in my first report. Because when I set the pen to the page, my hand simply stopped. The stool at the firefinder table was pulled out, angled back into the side, turned slightly, the exact way a chair sits when a person has just risen from it and stepped away without pushing it back in. Every other object in that room had settled into 40 years of perfect stillness. The dust proved it. But the stool sat like the person on it had stood up a minute before I came up the stairs, and set down their pen, and walked out through a locked door and a wired trap, and left not one single print in the dust of the floor between the stool and the sealed exits. The dust on the floor was continuous. I looked, and I looked again, and I raked the light low across it, hunting for the disturbance that had to be there. There were no footprints. There was a used, occupied writing station in the center of a sealed room, and no path of feet to it, and no path of feet away. I climbed down in the last of the light, and I did not look back up at the tower. I have thought about that decision every single day since, because even then, before I understood one true thing about that place, some animal part of me had already made a choice. And the choice was that it did not want to be seen looking. Roy met me at the gate a little after 9. He was leaning against the tailgate of his truck with a steel thermos. And when my headlamp swung across him, he lifted a hand, palm out, slow, the way you calm a spooked horse. He'd been waiting a while. There was a second cup already poured, sitting on the tailgate, gone cold. "You didn't take it," he said. "I left it. I couldn't have taken it if I wanted to. The place is sealed. Roy, what is this?" He poured coffee from the thermos into the cup and handed it to me, and I understood that he was buying himself a moment, choosing where to start with a thing he clearly did not want to say out loud. Then he said, "How many entries?" "On the last page, before today's." I had the camera on a lanyard around my neck. I brought up the image of the open logbook and zoomed in and counted the completed lines above the fresh one, and I told him, Four earlier entries above today's, then today's at the bottom of the page." Roy nodded, slow, the way a doctor nods when a patient describes the symptom he'd been praying not to hear. "Read me the dates," he said. "The 4 above." I read them, and this is where the floor first tilted under me and never fully came level again, because the 4 entries above today's were not from last week, or last month, or even last year. They were spaced years apart. The entry directly above today's was dated a little over 3 years ago. The one above 3 years ago. The one above that, 7 years ago. The one above that, 11. And the very top of the page, the first entry of the 5, was dated in the summer the tower was closed 31 years back. 5 entries on 1 page. 31 years of them. 1 page. That page, Roy said, looking not at me but up into the dark where the mountain was, started the summer they mothballed her, and it's got 1 page left in the book behind it. He drank. You made 5. That's not possible, I said, and I heard my own voice climb, and I hated it. Roy, the book's been locked in there since '94. The dust. Nobody's been inside. I checked the door. I checked the trap. The wires rusted solid. I know about the dust, Roy said. I've seen the dust. I saw it in '99, and I saw it again in '06. He stopped himself the way a man stops at the edge of a drop. He had said more than he meant to, and we both heard it. He set his cup down on the tailgate very carefully, as if it might spill something worse than coffee. Go home tonight, he said. Write your report. Say what you saw, and not 1 word of what you're guessing you'll want to guess. And if you write the guesses down, they'll follow you. Then come see me tomorrow, before you file anything with anybody. There's a box you need to look at first. And I'll tell you now, so you can decide on the drive home whether you want to keep going. Once you look in that box, you don't get to unlook. Some of the men whose names are on this thing spent the rest of their lives wishing they'd turned around at this gate. You can still turn around at this gate. I did not turn around at the gate. I think you already knew that, or you wouldn't be listening to this. And if you're the kind of person who wouldn't have turned around either, who has to know, who would rather carry a terrible answer than an easy silence, then do me a small favor before I go on, because what I found in that box is the part they tried hardest to keep buried. And the only reason accounts like this survive at all is that people pass them along. If this is landing on you the way it landed on me, take a second to follow along and leave a word below saying you're still with me, so this reaches the next person who needs to hear it before they climb a tower they shouldn't. All right. The box. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the photographs under the good lamp, and I counted the entries 100 times, and there were always 5. And I read the last page over and over until the words stopped being words. Every entry was competent. Every entry followed the format exactly. And the handwriting changed. That was the thing that got its hooks in me at 2 a.m. The 1994 entry, the first, the one at the top, was written in a tight, backward slanting hand, a left-hander's hand, cramped and careful. The entry from 3 years later was rounder, softer, open-looped, an entirely different person's writing. The one after that was blockish and hard-pressed, the letters gouged into the page like the writer leaned on the pen. The 3 years ago entry, just above mine, was a fast, forward-leaning scrawl. 5 entries, 5 distinct hands, 5 different people across 31 years, and every single one of them was written in the exact same voice. Not the same handwriting, the same voice, the same order of observations, precisely. The same abbreviations, the same shorthand, the same clipped procedural rhythm, as if 5 strangers separated by decades had all been trained by one identical instructor, and none of them had ever once deviated by a single habit. Visibility first, always, always in miles, always carried to 1 decimal place. Then wind, direction, and speed. Then temperature and relative humidity. Then the smoke line. and on the days with nothing burning, always the same 3 words in every hand. No smoke observed? Then a radio check. And here is where I sat forward in my chair, because every one of the 5 entries logged a completed radio check with the same station call sign, and a call sign I did not recognize, that matched no repeater or dispatch identifier I knew on a tower that had had no radio in it for 30 years. Radio check with a station that may not exist. Confirmed. In a room with an empty mounting frame and 4 bare bolt holes. The hands changed. The voice never did. Roy's box was in the district archive, in a run of shelving that did not appear in the archive's index. I checked the index the next morning before he brought it out, and the shelf numbers simply skipped, jumping from one range to the next with a gap in between that the catalog swore was empty. It was not empty. It held maybe a dozen boxes, and Roy pulled one and signed it out under his own name and set it on the reading table. And then he stood back with his arms crossed and watched me open it, the way you watch a man take his first step onto ice that took somebody last winter. Inside were inspection reports, structural assessments of Halverson Point Lookout, performed after its official closure at irregular intervals across 3 decades, and held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle and cracked into pieces when I touched it. A bundle of private correspondence addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand to a woman named Delphine Arsenault. I read the inspection reports first. There were 9 of them, and they were real. I want to be clear about that, because your instinct, like mine, will be to reach for the word forgery. And I reached for it too, and it broke in my hand. These were genuine Forest Service structural assessment forms on genuine letterhead, the paper aging correctly across the decades, the forms themselves changing as the service revised them over the years, the way real documents do an old typed form in the earliest one, a later revision by the middle of the stack, the modern format near the top. 9 inspectors, 9 different signatures, 9 different names, none of which I knew except one near the bottom of the stack, which I'll come back to because it stopped my heart. Each report was thorough and professional, the work of a competent person doing an ordinary job carefully. And each one reached the identical conclusion. I'm going to give it to you in the language of the reports, because the language is the horror, and I don't want to soften it by paraphrasing. Structure secured. No evidence of entry. Interior undisturbed. Original logbook present on firefinder table, open. New entries present since previous inspection. New entries present since previous inspection. 9 times. 9 inspectors, across 30 years, each one making the same brutal climb I'd made. Each one finding the same seized lock and the same rusted trap wire and the same undisturbed dust. And each one documenting in the flat, careful language of a government form that the logbook had gained entries since the previous inspector had stood in that same impossible sealed room. Every inspection confirmed the tower was empty. Every inspection confirmed that someone was still keeping the log. Both things. That same impossible sealed room. Every inspection confirmed the tower was empty. Every inspection confirmed that someone was still keeping the log. Both things, on the same form. In the same steady handwriting of a professional who had climbed a mountain, seen something that could not be, and reached for procedure the same way I had, because procedure is where you put the panic. And then I saw the thing that made me pull out a chair and sit down, because my legs had stopped being reliable. The inspections were not scheduled maintenance. They were responses. I read the trigger line on each one, and every single one of the 9 had been initiated the same way mine had, by the decommissioned emergency beacon transmitting a silent signal from a tower with no power. The beacon fired. The system paged someone. A ranger climbed up. The ranger found the book, found a fresh entry that hadn't been there at the last inspection, photographed it, came down, and wrote a report that could not be filed under any real category. That was the pattern. That was the shape of the thing, if a thing like this can be said to have a shape. The tower did not wait passively to be discovered. Every few years, on its own schedule, it reached out and called someone up the mountain. And it added that someone's visit to the record. None of the 9 inspections had ever been completed. Every report has a final section, recommended action and disposition, where the inspector is supposed to write what happens next: preserve, repurpose, demolish, defer. In all 9, that field was not filled in with any of those. In all 9, someone had written the same 2 words in the disposition box, and then never filed the follow-up that the form demanded. The words were, refer to appendix. Refer to appendix, 9 times across 30 years in 9 different hands. There was no appendix in the box. I asked Roy where it was. He looked at me for a long moment. I've been asking that question for a little over 20 years, he said. The only answer I ever got is that the appendix isn't held at the district level. It's held higher, at the Regional Records Annex, in a series that officially doesn't contain Forest Service material. And the people who'd know how to pull it are, every one of them, either dead or done answering their phones. I called the last name on my list in 2009. His daughter answered. She said he'd left instructions that if anyone ever called about Halverson, she was to say he'd already told them everything he intended to, and hang up. Then she hung up. Then he told me about Delphine. Delphine Arsenault had been the lookout at Halverson Point for the last 11 summers before it closed. She was the one who wired the trapdoor shut and carried the radio set down the mountain on her own back over 2 trips because they wouldn't send a mule. And she was, according to the closure paperwork, the writer of the very first entry on that last page, the tight, backward slanting, left-hander's hand, dated the summer they went dark. She had signed the log closed, officially, properly. And then, according to every record we held, she had gone home to a town 3 hours south and never worked another day for the service. The letters in the box were hers, or about her. For nearly 40 years, Delphine Arsenault had been quietly obtaining copies of every mysterious logbook entry that appeared at Halverson Point. She had a source inside the district, Roy would not say who. And by then, I had understood that the source was Roy. That Roy had spent 2 decades photographing that page after every beacon call and mailing the picture south to an old woman who had been the tower's last real keeper. Every time the beacon called a ranger up, and a new entry bloomed on that page. A photograph of it found its way to Delphine's mailbox. She kept them all. Her letters were her long, patient, decades-long attempt to make sense of what she was being sent. And they read like the private notebook of a woman circling a truth so slowly and so carefully because she could not afford to arrive at it. She was still alive, Roy said. 81 years old. And he had her address. I drove down the next weekend, off the clock, out of uniform, in my own truck. I told myself I was doing due diligence, that a witness present at the tower's closing was the last living link in a 30-year chain, and that any honest investigation owed her an interview. All of that was true. It was also true that I could not stop seeing the stool pushed back from the firefinder in a room with no footprints, and that I wanted an old woman to sit me down at her kitchen table and tell me the one reasonable thing that would make it all collapse into sense, and that some part of me already knew she was going to do the opposite. Delphine Arsenault lived in a small, scrupulously clean house at the end of a gravel road, with a vegetable garden going brown and soft for the fall, and a wind chime made of old survey tags on the porch. She opened the door before I knocked. She looked at my face for about 2 seconds, and whatever she was looking for, she found it, because her shoulders dropped a half-inch, and she said before I'd said one word, "It called someone again." "How long since the last one?" "A little over 3 years," I said. She nodded and stood aside to let me in, and led me to a kitchen table that was already covered, edge to edge, with the photographs. 30-odd years of them. She had them laid out in a grid, in date order. Like a game of solitaire, she had been losing her entire adult life and could not stop playing. I asked her first what happened in 1994. She poured tea neither of us drank and told me. She closed the tower the way you're supposed to when a lookout goes permanently dark. She swung the shutters down and locked them. She dropped the trap and wired it. She carried the radio down. And she wrote the last entry, a closing entry, the formal kind. Station out of service, log closed, her signature under it. She wrote it in that tight backward hand. And it is, to this day, the first of the 5 entries on that final page. The rest of the book behind it is blank. 3 years later, she said, the beacon went off for the first time, from my closed tower. I heard about it because I still knew people. A young ranger climbed up and found her sealed exactly as I'd left her. Dust and all 3 years of dust, undisturbed, and found my closed logbook lying open on the firefinder, with a new entry written under my closing line, dated the day he climbed, in a hand that was not mine. She let that sit. They asked me to identify the handwriting, she went on. That's the only official thing anyone ever asked me. They sent me a photograph and a form and asked whether I recognized the hand. It didn't match any lookout who had ever worked that tower. It didn't match any lookout who'd ever worked any tower in the district. It didn't match anyone. And I'd spent 11 summers up there. I knew every hand that had ever touched that book. And the entry itself. She reached into the grid and touched one photograph, the earliest, gently, the way you touch a wound. The entry opened the log back up. Do you understand what I'm telling you? My last line closed the station. The line underneath it, in a stranger's hand, dated 3 years after I'd gone, said the station was returning to service. I signed her closed, and something signed her open again. I asked the question I had carried up that mountain and down it and 3 hours south. The question that had been sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. Who's keeping the log, Delphine? Who's writing in it? She didn't answer right away. She turned one of the photographs toward me instead, the last page, the same page I had in my own camera. Hers and mine were nearly identical, except that hers was decades older. And where my photograph showed 5 entries filling the page, hers, taken so long ago, showed only 2. Her closing note, and beneath it, the single entry that had reopened the tower. For a long time, she said, I believed the tower was haunted, that some lookout had died up there before my time and simply kept working, kept the watch, because the watch was the whole of who she was. It's a comforting story in its way, a ghost who won't leave her post. But that's a child's answer, and I stopped believing it a good many years ago. She put one finger on the second entry, the reopening one. Because look at the handwriting on this one. Now look at the third. Her finger moved down to my photograph, which I'd laid beside hers. Now the fourth. Now yours. Her finger walked down the page, entry by entry, hand by hand. Every one of these, she said, is a different person. A haunting is one soul. This is not one soul. And every one of these people climbed that mountain because the beacon called them up. And every one of them. Her voice, which had been so steady, finally went quiet. Was a ranger the service sent to inspect an empty tower. I told her I didn't understand. And I truly didn't, not yet. I had all the pieces on the table in front of me, and I could not make them assemble, because my mind kept insisting on the wrong shape, kept insisting that somewhere out there was a person doing the writing, and that the whole mystery was the identity of that person. The inspections don't find who's keeping the log, Delphine said slowly, patiently. The way you explain something to a person you are fond of and afraid for. The inspections are how the log gets kept. Do you see it now? Whoever climbs up and finds the book open and reads the last entry, and then documents what he saw, he makes the next entry. He thinks he's recording the anomaly. He is the anomaly. The photograph he takes, the report he writes, the observation he can't stop himself from making of the perfect empty room that becomes the line on the page, in his own hand, whether he ever holds the pen or not. That is why not one of those 9 reports was ever finished. That is why the disposition box always says refer to appendix and nothing ever follows. You cannot recommend an action for a thing that turns the man you sent to inspect it into its next entry. There's no box on the form for that. She looked at me then with an expression I've never been able to describe to anyone. A look of such old and settled and terrible gentleness that it frightened me more than anything on the mountain had. You went up 3 days ago, she said. Count the page again. How many entries? 5, I said. There were 4 when the ranger before you came down, 3 years ago. I have his photograph right here. She lifted it, held it up. 4 entries clear on the page. 4. You made 5. I told her, and I heard the heat in my own voice, the desperation of a man defending the last of his certainty, that I had not written anything, that I had left the book on the table, that I had never even opened it, never touched it, that I'd counted through a 4-inch gap in a warped shutter and photographed it, and climbed back down, that there was no way, that anything on that page was mine. Delphine Arsenault nodded, as though I'd said exactly what she expected. And she reached into the grid, into the newest corner of it, and drew out one more photograph, and slid it across the table to me. This one was fresh. The paper was still glossy, the colors still bright, the corner not yet softened. It was the last page of the Halverson Point log, photographed after I'd come down off the Mountain Roy's photograph. Mailed to her, already arrived, because of course it had. And there were 5 entries. And the 5th, the one dated that second Tuesday in September, the one I had photographed and would have sworn on my career I had never touched, was written in a fast, forward-leaning hand. I knew that handwriting. I had signed 19 years of documents with it. I signed my name that way, that exact forward lean, the way the R runs into the letters after it, the little upward tick I leave on my terminal letters that a graphologist once told me at a fair meant I was stubborn. The 5th entry was mine. Visibility in miles carried to 1 decimal. Wind, direction, and speed. Temperature and humidity. No smoke observed. A radio check with that same station, whose call sign I've never heard in my life, logged as confirmed. And a closing line in my own unmistakable hand, in a format I was never taught, but that I read as easily as my own name. Log current, awaiting relief. I do not remember driving home. 3 hours of mountain road, and I have nothing of it. I remember Delphine's porch, and I remember my own kitchen, and nothing between. I filed a report that said only what I had seen, and not one word of what I was guessing, exactly as Roy had told me. I did not mention the 5th entry. There was no category for it. There is no incident code in the entire Forest Service classification system, for I found a logbook entry written in my own handwriting that I did not write. And beneath the practical reason, there was a second reason, a worse one, which was that I had become afraid, genuinely, physically afraid, that writing it down in an official record was itself the act. That the report was the pen. That to document the entry was to make it true. The same way the 9 inspectors before me had made their entries true by documenting the empty room. I did not want to add my name to that appendix, so I left it out. And in leaving it out, I finally understood in my body why every one of those 9 reports before mine had a blank where the answer should be. The tower was reclassified that winter. I have handled the reclassification of a lot of infrastructure in my career, and I made a point of watching this one move through the system. And it did not move the way those things normally move. Halverson Point Lookout, the paperwork now said, was formally classified as abandoned. And when I finally tracked down the underlying justification in that regional records annex Roy had named, the one that officially holds no Forest Service material, which took me 4 months and 2 favors to get into for an afternoon, I found the memorandum. And I understood the whole architecture of the lie. Halverson Point had not been classified abandoned in 1994 because the structure had become unsafe. Every one of the 9 structural inspections had found it sound. Aging, weathering, but sound. That was never the reason. It had been formally classified abandoned in a memorandum whose authoring office I could not identify, because the signature block named only a role and not a person, for a reason stated in language I have never forgotten, and will repeat to you exactly, because I copied it down before they took the file back. Subject structure to be classified abandoned. Basis: Repeated inspection has confirmed the continued performance of official lookout duties at this location subsequent to elimination of the position. No administrative mechanism exists to reassign or terminate a duty being performed by no assignable person. Classification of the structure as abandoned is the sole available action. Read that again the way I did, in that cold annex, and let it land. They did not declare the tower abandoned because no one was there. They declared it abandoned because someone was, because the watch was still being kept, decade after decade, by no one they could name, fire, or reassign. And the only tool a bureaucracy has for a duty that will not stop being performed by a person who cannot be found is to put on paper, formally and forever, that there is no one there at all. Abandoned is not a description of the tower. It is a spell. It is the word they used to look away. The tower was never the point. Roy told me that at the very end, on the last day before his own retirement, when I finally understood enough to be worth telling, we were standing at that same gate. The service didn't preserve Halverson Point, he said. It contained it. And the thing it's containing was never the building's just where it lives. It's the logbook, a record that will not accept being closed. One page left, and it fills that page one climber at a time, on its own schedule. And it has never once, in 34 years, failed to find someone to send up that mountain when it needed the next line. It doesn't need a lookout who's willing. It never advertised the job. It just needs a book and a beacon and one page. He looked up at the dark shape of the mountain the way I'd seen him look at it before. There were 10 entries when you got there, counting my 2. There's 11 now. There's one line left after yours. He didn't say what would happen when the page filled. I didn't ask. I think we both already knew there is always another book behind the last page. I retired 6 years ago. I told myself I had let it go, and mostly, for a while, I had. Roy passed the year after his retirement, his heart, they said, in his sleep, which I chose to believe. Delphine passed the winter after that, and I drove down for the service and found that she had left instructions for her grid of photographs to be given to me. 40 years of a page filling one line at a time, and I have them in a box in my closet that I do not open. I moved to a town without a view of any mountains, which is harder to do in this country than you'd think, and I did not think about Halverson Point for months at a stretch, and I believed, God help me, that it was over, that it had taken its one line from me and let me go. Until last month. A padded envelope arrived from a Forest Service historical preservation contractor I had never heard of, with a cover letter explaining a routine project, the digitization of legacy lookout logbooks for permanent archival preservation, part of a heritage initiative, everything being scanned at high resolution and preserved forever in a secured digital repository. And because I was the ranger of record on the final documented Halverson Point incident, they were sending me, as a professional courtesy, a copy of the completed scan of that tower's logbook. A kindness, a dead book, preserved forever, sealed now behind glass and pixels and backup servers where it could never gain another line, where the paper itself was now beside the point. I actually felt relief when I understood what it was. Preserved, finished, behind glass. I opened the file at my kitchen table, and I scrolled through it. And there it all was. 31 years. 5 hands on the last written page, one voice throughout. The closing entries, the reopening entries, the 9 inspectors' lines between. My own page, exactly as I remembered it. 5 entries. Mine at the bottom. Log current, awaiting relief, preserved forever, and harmless now. And then there was a 6th page. A page that had never existed. A page that was not in Delphine's 40 years of photographs. Not in Roy's. Not in a single one of the 9 inspections. Not in my own camera. A page after the last page. In a book that had, for 34 years, only ever had 1 page left. The scanner had caught it clean and sharp and perfectly lit, every stroke crisp, the ink darker than the aged entries above it. Fresh, wet-looking even. The way the first entry had looked wet to me through the gap in the shutters on that Tuesday in September. The date field was filled in, and the date was 3 years from now. The observations were perfect, visibility unlimited, no wind, no smoke. A cloudless afternoon, the kind of day a lookout waits all season for. And at the bottom of the entry, in a fast, forward-leaning hand, the R running into the letters after it. The stubborn, upward tick on the terminal letters. The hand I have signed my whole life, was the closing line. The replacement finally arrived, before sunset. Log continues. I have no memory of writing it. I have never held that pen. And I have 3 years, a little less now, as I record this before the date at the top of that page comes around, and the beacon fires again, from a tower that is officially abandoned. And the system pages whoever is next on a routing that someone configured long ago. And a ranger who has never heard of me makes the difficult climb up the north spine of the Elwater, and finds the door still sealed, and the dust undisturbed, and the stool pushed back from the firefinder, and 1 page left in the book, waiting. The replacement finally arrived before sunset. I have read that line 10,000 times, and I understand it now. And I'm telling you all of this while I still recognize my own hand. While the man in this account and the man recording it are still, I believe, the same man. Because there is exactly one thing that place ever wanted me to understand, and here it is. Every abandoned fire lookout you have ever seen, every empty glass box on stilts standing shuttered and locked and silent above the tree line, every one you've driven past and thought, how sad, how lonely, how forgotten is a lookout, only because no one has climbed up yet to find the book open. That is the only difference between an abandoned tower and a manned one. Not power, not a radio, not a person, just whether the last climber has come, and the reason they still stand, all of them, all across this country, unfallen, undemolished, waiting through the winters that should have taken them down. The reason no one ever quite gets around to tearing them down is that a log that will not close does not need a lookout, who is willing. It only needs one who climbs. So this is the part where I ask you for something. And I mean it as plainly as I've meant everything else. I don't know how many of these towers there are. I don't know how many books have 1 page left. I know that this account is the only warning that exists. Because every man who could have written one before me left a blank where the answer should go. So if this reached you, pass it on. Share it with the one person you know who can't drive past an old tower without wanting to climb it, because they are exactly who the beacon calls. Leave a comment telling me if you've ever seen a lookout standing empty on a ridge and felt, for no reason you could name, that you should not go up. And if you want to know what happens when that page finally fills, And whether the ranger who comes after me climbs down again or simply becomes the next line. Subscribe and stay with me, because I have 3 years, and I intend to spend them finding the appendix, and I will tell you everything I find while I still have the hand to tell it in. If I stop, you'll know the beacon fired early. And if you're ever on a mountain road at dusk, and you see one of them up there against the last of the light, shutters down, waiting, do yourself the one kindness those 9 men couldn't manage. Don't climb up to see if anyone's still keeping watch. Because someone always is, and there's always one line left.